A clay tablet survived from the ancient world with a claim that should not exist. It says kings ruled before the flood, not for decades, not for centuries, for tens of thousands of years. One king reigns for 28,800 years, another for 36,000. Altogether, 8 rulers hold power for nearly 250,000 years before disaster breaks the world in two. This is not a modern fantasy novel. It is part of the Sumerian King List, a record copied by scribes from one of humanity's earliest civilizations. At first glance, it feels impossible, but impossibility is not the end of the story. Sometimes, when an ancient text refuses to behave like history, the mistake is not only in the text. It may also be in the way we are reading it. Tonight, we begin with a list, not a palace, not a battlefield, not the tomb of a forgotten ruler, but a written sequence of names, cities, and impossible years, pressed into clay by hands that belong to a world older than most stories we still remember. The Sumerians were not careless people. They counted grain, measured fields, recorded offerings, and built a civilization where writing itself became a tool of power. So why preserve a chronology that appears, to modernize, almost absurd? Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. Because the question is not simply whether these kings truly lived for 240,000 years. The deeper question is why anyone believed those numbers belonged at the beginning of history. Chapter 2. When Kingship Descended from Heaven. The Sumerian King List does not begin like a normal political record. It does not begin with a battle. It does not begin with a treaty, a dynasty, or the proud announcement of a ruler carving his name into the world. It begins with an idea that is much older and stranger than politics as we usually imagine it. After kingship had descended from heaven, that phrase is easy to pass over. It sounds ceremonial, almost decorative, the kind of grand language ancient scribes might use, because ancient scribes rarely did anything without a certain amount of gravity. But in this case, the phrase is not decoration. It is the doorway into the entire world of the text. Kingship, in this vision, is not something human beings invent because they need taxes collected, canals organized, or enemies kept away from the city wall. It is not simply a social contract, not merely a practical arrangement, not the result of one ambitious man persuading enough armed men to stand behind him. Kingship descends. It comes from above. It arrives as a sacred institution, entrusted to humanity by powers beyond humanity. That matters because the King List is not just asking who ruled first. It is asking where authority itself came from. To a modern reader, kingship can look like an office, a title, a position in a hierarchy. We think in terms of governments, borders, institutions, and legitimacy granted by constitutions or armies or public consent. But in ancient Sumer, power belonged to a different mental landscape. The ruler stood between the city and the gods. He was not necessarily a god himself, and the evidence for divine kingship varies across Mesopotamian history, but he occupied a charged space. His authority was tangled with temples, offerings, rituals, cosmic order, irrigation, warfare, justice, and the fragile survival of urban life. A city did not simply need a strong leader. It needed the gods to accept that leader. This is why the opening of the King List feels so calm and so enormous at the same time. It does not argue for monarchy. It assumes monarchy has a sacred origin. It places rulership outside ordinary human debate before the story has even properly begun. Kingship is not presented as a local invention from one city's clever politics. It is something bestowed, and when something is bestowed, it can also be withdrawn. That quiet implication runs through the entire list. Kingship descends to one city, then later moves to another. It rests somewhere for a time, then departs. Cities rise into divine favor and fall out of it. The structure gives history a kind of rhythm, not random conquest, not messy rivalry, but a sacred transfer of authority. The world may have been full of competing city-states, each with its own ambitions and loyalties. Yet the King List smooths that disorder into a single line of legitimate rule. This is not a minor detail. It is one of the document's most revealing choices. Because if kingship can descend from heaven, then whoever claims to inherit it is not merely saying, "My city won." He is saying, "My city is where cosmic order has chosen to reside." That is a much stronger claim. It turns politics into theology. It turns succession into destiny. It turns a list of names into an argument about the shape of the world. And this may be one reason the impossible reigns were preserved with such care. The early kings do not belong to ordinary time because the beginning of kingship does not belong to ordinary politics. The first age is presented as closer to the gods, and therefore larger than life in a very literal sense. Its numbers stretch beyond human experience. Its rulers seem too vast for history. But perhaps that is the point. They are not meant to look like later kings who fought border wars, built walls, and left inscriptions. They stand at the edge of human memory, where sacred order first touches the earth. The phrase, "descended from heaven," also helps explain why the King List feels both historical and mythic without seeming embarrassed by either category. The scribes who copied it were not necessarily trying to trick anyone. They were preserving a worldview in which the divine and the political were not separate departments. A temple economy, a royal court, a city's identity, and the favor of the gods could all be part of one living system. To us, that can feel confusing. We want to know whether something is fact or myth. We ask whether the list is reliable or fictional, literal or symbolic, record or legend. But the King List resists that neat sorting. It belongs to a culture where a statement could carry authority not only because it documented an event, but because it expressed a sacred pattern. That does not mean the list is useless as history. Far from it. It means we have to read it carefully, almost sideways. Its value may not lie in proving that a named king sat on a throne for 36,000 years. Its value lies in showing that, for the people who preserved this tradition, kingship had to be older than any living dynasty, older than any rival city, older even than the flood that would later tear the story apart. Power needed an origin worthy of obedience, and so before the first cities are named, before the first impossible reigns begin, the King List gives us its foundation. Authority came from above. Human beings did not seize the first crown from the mud. It descended. From that moment, the story is no longer only about kings. It is about the ancient need to believe that power has a source beyond power itself. Chapter 3. The Cities Before the Flood. Before the flood arrives in the King List, The world is not empty. It already has cities. That detail is easy to miss, because the impossible reigns draw the eye first. The numbers are so enormous that they almost swallow the landscape around them. But the oldest layer of the story is not only made of kings, it is made of places: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, and Shurupak, names that appear like islands of order in a world before the Great Rupture. These are not presented as random settlements. They are the first stations of kingship, the earliest places where divine authority touches the earth and takes a civic form. In the logic of the King List, kingship does not descend vaguely upon humanity. It descends somewhere. It lands in a city. That is a deeply Mesopotamian idea. For the Sumerians, the city was not just a concentration of houses. It was a sacred and economic machine, a place where canals, temples, workshops, fields, scribes, priests, laborers, and rulers all depended on one another. The city organized human life, but it also gave that life a cosmic address. A god belonged to a city, a temple anchored that relationship, a ruler served within it, or at least claimed to. So when the King List names the cities before the flood, it is doing more than arranging geography. It is building a sacred map. Eridu comes first. Then kingship moves to Bad Tibira, then to Larak, then to Sipar, then to Shurupak. The movement feels deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if authority is passing from one holy station to another across a landscape that is already old in the imagination of the scribes who preserved it. And this is where the mystery becomes more interesting than a simple question of accuracy. Because some of these places were real. They were not invented for a bedtime legend. Eridu, for example, was a real and ancient city in southern Mesopotamia, remembered as a place of extraordinary antiquity. Shurupak, too, was a real city, and in Mesopotamian flood traditions it becomes associated with the figure who survives the coming catastrophe. The King List is not floating in pure fantasy. It attaches its most mythic claims to recognizable locations. That makes the text harder to dismiss. If the list had named impossible kings in impossible cities, we might know what to do with it. We could file it neatly under myth and leave it there. But instead, it gives us real places wrapped in impossible time. It plants legendary reigns inside a geography that scribes and rulers could point toward, copy, remember, and perhaps even claim. This mixture is one of the reasons the King List still feels unsettling. It does not separate memory from theology. It does not mark one line and say, "Here begins history," and another line and say, "Here ends legend." Occupy the same clay surface. To modern readers, that feels almost careless, but to the ancient scribe, it may have felt truthful in a different way. A city could be real and still be sacred. A king could be remembered and still be magnified. A place could preserve the echo of an ancient political center while also becoming a stage for cosmic meaning. The earliest cities in the King List may not give us reliable chronology in the modern sense, but they tell us something important about how civilization imagined its own beginnings. It did not begin in wilderness. It began in ordered spaces, in named cities, under a kingship that had descended from heaven. There is also a political intelligence hidden in this arrangement. By naming city after city, the list creates a chain of custody for power. Kingship is not scattered. It does not belong to every strong man who can raise a wall or command a canal crew. It moves in a sequence. It has a path. And that path passes through cities whose names carry weight. That matters because ancient Mesopotamia was not a single peaceful kingdom, waiting patiently for one throne to guide it. It was a world of rival cities, shifting alliances, local traditions, and competing claims. Each city could remember itself as central. Each could tell a story in which its god, its temple, its ruler, and its people mattered most. The King List does something more ambitious. It gathers those local memories into one grand line. It says, in effect, that there was one kingship, even if there were many cities. That does not mean the real political world worked that way. It almost certainly did not, at least not consistently. But the list is not merely describing power as it was. It is shaping power as it wanted to be understood. The chaos of many cities becomes the dignity of a single inheritance. And in the antediluvian section, that inheritance feels almost untouched by ordinary human conflict. The cities appear not as crowded, noisy places full of bargaining, labor, rivalry, and anxiety, but as sacred centers in a mythic landscape. We do not hear the voices of farmers. We do not see merchants arguing over weights. We do not follow families storing grain or repairing reed houses after a storm. The list is not interested in that kind of life. It is interested in legitimacy. That absence is important. The first cities of the King List are not described from the ground up, but from the throne down. They are remembered because kingship rested there. Their significance comes through divine authority, not daily experience. This is one of the quiet ways official history narrows the world. It can make a city appear majestic while leaving out almost everyone who actually kept it alive. Still, the names matter. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, and Shurupak form the pre-flood horizon of the text. They stand before catastrophe like markers on the edge of memory. We cannot treat their reign lengths as straightforward historical data. We should be cautious with every number and every claim, but we also should not flatten them into nonsense. Their survival suggests that the scribes inherited traditions in which real places had become containers for sacred time, and perhaps that is the point. The King List does not begin with humanity wandering without order. It begins with kingship descending, cities receiving it, and time expanding around them until it no longer resembles ordinary life. Before the flood, civilization is already imagined as ancient, structured, divinely touched, and impossibly remote. The cities before the flood are not merely settings. They are the first attempt to answer a question every civilization eventually asks. Where did our order come from? And in the Sumerian imagination, the answer was not a single man or a single invention or a single day when people decided to obey. It was a chain of sacred cities holding kingship for spans of time so vast that human memory could only approach them as myth. Chapter 4. 8 kings and 240,000 years. Then come the kings themselves, not as portraits, not as personalities, not as men with habits, fears, ambitions, or faces. The King List gives them to us in a colder, stranger form. A name, a city, and a reign so long that the mind almost refuses to hold it. Alulim reigns in Eridu for 28,800 years. Al-Algar follows for 36,000. Then kingship moves, and the years continue to expand across the tablet like something no human life was ever meant to measure. By the time the pre-flood sequence ends, 8 kings have ruled across 5 cities for a total of 241,200 years. It is a number that feels less like chronology than architecture. You do not read it and imagine an old man sitting on a throne for 30,000 winters. You imagine a civilization trying to build a bridge backward into the deepest possible past, and making that bridge so immense that ordinary memory cannot cross it. This is the central tension of the Sumerian King List. It presents itself like a record. It has sequence. It has cities. It has reigns. It has the plain, administrative confidence of a document that knows exactly what it is doing, and yet the content of that record immediately breaks the rules of biological life. No human king ruled for 36,000 years. That much we can say without caution. But the more interesting question is why the list says it anyway. There is a temptation, especially in modern retellings, to treat these numbers as a puzzle waiting for a single hidden key. Maybe the years were mistranslated. Maybe they were not years at all. Maybe the scribes meant months, seasons, lunar cycles, dynastic periods, or symbolic units that later readers misunderstood. Some of those ideas are worth considering carefully, especially when we look at ancient number systems. But we should be cautious about forcing the mystery to become simpler than it is. The King List may not be a broken clock. It may be a different kind of clock altogether. The 8 pre-flood kings are placed in a world before the great catastrophe, before history is reset. Their reigns belong to a sacred age, and sacred ages often work by different proportions. In many ancient traditions, the earliest world is not just earlier, it is bigger. People are stronger. Ancestors are closer to the divine. Time itself seems to move on a grander scale. The Sumerian King List fits that instinct almost perfectly. The first rulers are not merely old, they are impossibly old. Their greatness is expressed through duration. To reign for tens of thousands of years is not just to survive. It is to embody a cosmic stability that later kings could only claim in miniature. And notice what the list does not do. It does not tell us that these kings conquered distant lands. It does not describe their laws. It does not preserve their speeches, their family troubles, their funerals, their crimes, or their triumphs. Their individuality is reduced almost entirely to the length of their rule. That is revealing. For the antediluvian kings, time is the message. Their reign lengths are not attached to ordinary biography because they are doing a different kind of work. They stretch the origin of kingship into a past beyond argument. A dynasty that lasts for a few generations can be challenged. A city that becomes powerful in living memory can be resented, but a kingship that begins hundreds of thousands of years before the present, descending from heaven and passing through sacred cities before the flood, becomes almost impossible to rival on ordinary terms. It is not merely old, it is primordial. This helps explain why the numbers feel both absurd and powerful. Their impossibility is not a flaw that accidentally weakens the text. It may be part of what gives the text its force. The reigns announce that the first age was not like this age. The first kings were not like later kings. The beginning of rule happened at a scale that ordinary human beings could only inherit, not recreate. There is a quiet political advantage in that. If kingship began in an age of divine magnitude, then later rulers could present themselves not as temporary winners in a violent human contest, but as heirs to an order older than the flood. Their authority did not need to begin with them. In fact, it was stronger if it did not. Power becomes more convincing when it can pretend to be ancient. The numbers also create a strange emotional distance. We can remember a king who ruled for 40 years. We can imagine the aging of a palace, the arrival of children, the death of rivals, the building of a canal. But 28,800 years empties the scene of ordinary human texture. It becomes almost geological. The king stops feeling like a person and begins to resemble a marker in sacred time. That may frustrate us as historians because we want recoverable people. We want evidence that can be weighed, dated, compared, and tested. But as storytellers of civilization, the King List gives us something else, an image of power before it became human-sized. The 8 kings stand at the threshold between myth and history, but they do not politely choose a side. They are named like rulers and measured like gods. Their cities are real enough to matter, but their reigns are too vast to be literal. They are political ancestors, theological symbols, and perhaps distorted memories all at once. This is where the King List becomes most dangerous to read carelessly. If we take the reigns literally, we abandon evidence. If we dismiss them as nonsense, we abandon meaning. The better path is narrower and more demanding. We have to let the numbers be impossible and still ask what kind of truth they were meant to carry. That truth may not be about lifespan. It may be about legitimacy. It may be about cosmic order. It may be about the feeling that the first world was more immense than the present one, and that civilization began under conditions no later generation could fully understand. The total, 241,200 years, is often rounded in popular imagination into the shadow of 240,000 years. Either way, the effect is the same. The number towers over the rest of the list. Later reigns shrink. Later rulers become more recognizable. The closer the text moves toward history, the smaller time becomes. That shrinking matters. It suggests a movement from sacred vastness toward human scale. Before the flood, kingship lives in a world too large for ordinary chronology. After the flood, the numbers begin to descend, though not immediately into realism. The transition is gradual, uneven, and fascinating. But here, before the waters arrive, everything remains enormous. 8 kings, 5 cities, more than 240,000 years. The list gives us no explanation, no apology, no sign that the scribe felt the need to defend the numbers. They are simply there, pressed into clay with the same seriousness as any tax account or temple record. And perhaps that is what makes them so haunting. Not that ancient people could believe impossible things. Every age does that in its own way. But that one of the earliest civilizations we know chose to place impossibility at the beginning of political history, as if power to be believed first had to become larger than life. Chapter 5. The Problem of Ancient Numbers. The numbers are the part of the King List that trouble us most. Not the gods, not the flood, not even the idea that kingship descended from heaven. Modern readers can usually find a way to understand mythic language, at least from a distance, but numbers feel different. Numbers look precise. They seem to promise measurement, not metaphor. A number carved into clay feels as if it should behave, and these numbers do not behave. A reign of 28,800 years does not merely stretch credibility. It destroys the ordinary frame in which credibility works. It leaves us standing in front of the text with a very simple problem. Either the scribes were recording something they did not mean literally, or they were using numbers in a way that does not match our habits of reading. Probably both possibilities deserve attention. The Sumerians were not vague about mathematics. This is one of the first misunderstandings to clear away. The impossible reigns were not written by people who could barely count. Mesopotamian scribes belonged to a culture with sophisticated systems of accounting, measurement, land calculation, and astronomical observation. Their world depended on numbers. Grain had to be distributed. Labor had to be organized. Fields had to be measured. Temple stores had to be tracked. A civilization built around irrigation cannot afford to be casual about quantity. So when enormous numbers appear in the King List, it is not enough to say, ancient people exaggerated. They may have exaggerated, yes, but they exaggerated with structure. The Sumerian numerical world used a sexagesimal system based on units of 60. That legacy has never fully left us. Every time we divide an hour into 60 minutes, or a circle into 360 degrees, we are still living with the shadow of Mesopotamian mathematics. It is one of history's quieter survivals, a way of counting born in the ancient Near East, still ticking inside modern clocks. This matters because many of the King List's pre-flood reigns are not random-looking numbers. They often appear as large, clean multiples within a numerical culture that valued certain units and proportions. The numbers have a formal quality. They feel composed, not accidental. Their size may shock us, but their pattern suggests intention. That does not solve the mystery. It deepens it. Because now the question shifts. We are no longer asking only whether the reigns are wrong. We are asking what kind of meaning a trained scribe might have seen in a number like 36,000. To us, 36,000 years is a biological impossibility. To a scribe shaped by a different intellectual world, it may also have carried a kind of symbolic grandeur. A large number could express more than duration. It could express rank, sacred distance, completeness, cosmic scale, or the difference between the first age and the ordinary world. This is difficult for modern readers because we tend to separate arithmetic from symbolism. Of course, we still use numbers symbolically all the time, though we rarely admit it. We say 1,000 thanks without counting. We call something 1 in a million without consulting population statistics. We celebrate anniversaries in round numbers because they feel complete. We treat certain numbers as lucky, unlucky, sacred, impressive, or suspicious. Even now, numbers can carry emotion while pretending to be neutral. Ancient scribes did not necessarily pretend otherwise. Their numbers could measure, but numbers could also arrange the world. This is especially important in a text like the King List, which is not a ledger of barley rations. It resembles a historical document, but it is also a theological and political composition. The numbers are part of its architecture. They help divide time into ages. Before the flood, time is vast, ordered, and almost divine. After the flood, it contracts. Reigns become shorter. The world becomes more recognizable. The movement from immense numbers toward more human ones is itself a kind of narrative. In other words, the numbers are not just information inside the story. They help tell the story. There are several ways scholars and interpreters have tried to approach this. Some suggest that the reign lengths may preserve distorted memories of dynasties rather than individuals. In that reading, one king might stand for a line of rulers, a house, or a long phase of authority later compressed into a single name. Others look at the mathematics itself, noticing that the reigns are arranged in meaningful multiples and may reflect numerological thinking rather than literal lifespan. Still others treat the antediluvian section as a mythic preface attached to a more historically useful list of later rulers. Each approach explains something. None explains everything. If the kings are dynasties, why preserve them as individual rulers? If the numbers are symbolic, why these particular names and cities? If the pre-flood section is mythic, why place it in the same sequence as later kings who move closer to history? The king list keeps slipping out of every container we put around it. That slipperiness may be part of its original power. The list does not ask the reader to choose between number and myth. It allows number to serve myth. It uses the authority of calculation to give shape to sacred time. The result is a chronology that looks exact and impossible at once. There is something almost unsettling about that combination. A vague legend can be dismissed easily. Long ago, it says, a great king ruled. We know how to handle that. But the king list does not say merely long ago. It gives a figure. It counts the years. It uses precision to describe the immeasurable. That is why the tablet still catches the modern imagination. It is not simply that the reigns are long. It is that they are long in a way that feels deliberate, formal, and recorded. We should be careful, though, not to turn ancient number symbolism into a blank check for fantasy. The fact that the numbers may be symbolic does not mean they can mean anything we want. It does not prove hidden technologies, lost immortals, or secret calendars waiting to be decoded by wishful thinking. Responsible interpretation moves more slowly. It asks what the text is doing within its own cultural world. And within that world, the huge numbers seem to mark the earliest kings as belonging to a time beyond ordinary human scale. They make the pre-flood world feel complete, remote, and sacred. They place kingship in a past so deep that later rulers could only look back toward it. They transform political authority into something with cosmic age behind it. So the problem of ancient numbers is not merely that they are too large. The problem is that they are doing too much. They count, but they also elevate. They record, but they also sanctify. They frustrate historians, but they reveal the imagination of the scribes who preserved them. To read them well, we have to resist two easy mistakes, believing them literally or dismissing them completely. Somewhere between those mistakes, the king list becomes more interesting. Its impossible arithmetic may not tell us how long the first kings lived, but it tells us that, for the people who copied and preserved this tradition, the beginning of rule could not be measured in ordinary years. It had to be placed on a scale large enough to touch heaven, old enough to survive the flood, and precise enough to look like truth on clay. Chapter 6, Eridu, the first city of kings. Eridu sits at the beginning like a memory older than memory. In the king list, kingship does not first descend into a nameless plane. It does not appear in a vague long ago without coordinates. It descends to Eridu. That choice matters. Eridu was not just another name in the southern Mesopotamian landscape. It was remembered as one of the oldest sacred centers of the region, a place whose importance seems to have outlived its political strength. There are cities that rule because they command armies. There are cities that endure because they command the imagination. Eridu belongs to the second kind. To later Mesopotamian tradition, Eridu carried the aura of beginnings. It was associated with deep antiquity, with sacred order, and with the god Enki, a deity linked to wisdom, fresh water, craft, and the hidden sources of life beneath the earth. We should be careful here. The King List itself does not pause to give us a guided tour of Eridu's temples or theology. It simply places the first kings there. But that placement would not have felt neutral to ancient readers or listeners. A first city is never only a city, it becomes an argument. By beginning at Eridu, the list gives kingship an origin that feels ancient, holy, and difficult to challenge. Imagine the scene not as a literal reconstruction, because the evidence does not allow that, but as a way of entering the logic of the text. A low settlement in the southern alluvium. Reed beds, water channels, heat pressing against mud brick walls. A temple precinct rising not as decoration, but as the center around which human order gathers. In a place like this, power would not have felt separate from survival. Water, grain, labor, ritual, and authority belong to the same fragile system. This is one reason Eridu is such a powerful opening setting. It reminds us that the earliest cities were not abstract symbols. They were experiments in living together under pressure. Fields had to be watered, food had to be stored, offerings had to be made, disputes had to be settled. The gods had to be honored. The city was both practical and sacred, a place where the daily and the cosmic met over mud, grain, and water. The King List compresses all of that into one statement. Kingship was in Eridu, and then it gives Eridu two kings whose reigns are impossible. Alulim and Alalgar do not appear to us as fully recoverable historical individuals. We do not have enough evidence to treat them the way we might treat later kings who left inscriptions, building records, or references in multiple sources. Their reigns belong to the pre-flood world of the list, where memory has already become symbolic. But the names are still doing work. They anchor the first age of kingship to a place with real cultural weight. That combination is the key. Real place. Mythic time. Eridu allows the King List to do something that pure fantasy could not do as effectively. It makes the unreachable past feel located. The first kings may be beyond ordinary history, but they are not nowhere. Their world touches a city that people could remember, visit, honor, or invoke. The myth does not float away. It is tied to the ground. This is often how ancient memory works. It does not preserve the past in the tidy categories we prefer. A real sanctuary can gather legends around itself. A once important city can become larger in memory after its political power fades. A sacred landscape can turn historical depth into theological meaning. Over time, the question, "What happened here?" can become inseparable from, "Why does this place matter?" Eridu's role in the King List may preserve a faint memory of southern Mesopotamia's earliest urban and religious development, but we should not overstate what can be proven. The list is not an archaeological report. It does not tell us how Eridu grew, how its institutions formed, or how power actually operated in its earliest phases. It gives us something different. The image of a first city worthy of receiving heaven's kingship. That image is historically valuable, even if it is not historically literal. It tells us what later scribes and traditions wanted the beginning to look like. Not chaotic, not accidental, not born from violence alone. The beginning had a sacred address. Authority arrived in a city already capable of holding it. There is a kind of elegance in that claim. The list does not say kingship descended into a wilderness and created civilization from nothing. It suggests that the city and kingship belong together from the start. Order is urban. Sacred power is civic. The throne is not simply a seat for one man. It is part of a larger arrangement connecting gods, rulers, temples, and people. And yet, beneath that elegance, there is a tension. If Eridu was the first city of kings, why did kingship leave? The king list does not linger on the reason. It does not explain a rebellion, a failure, an invasion, or a divine judgment. It simply moves on. Kingship passes to another city. That movement is one of the text's strangest habits. It treats the relocation of supreme authority almost like a cosmic fact, not a political struggle. For a document so interested in legitimacy, it is often remarkably silent about the messy mechanisms by which power changes hands. That silence should make us attentive. The list turns political discontinuity into sacred sequence, a transfer that may, in real life, have involved rivalry, conquest, collapse, or shifting influence becomes smooth on clay. Eridu receives kingship. Eridu holds it for impossible ages. Then kingship moves. No blood, no bargaining, no administrative chaos, no angry elites, no hungry workers, just divine order changing address. This is not a flaw in the text. It is part of the text's purpose. The king list is less interested in explaining political conflict than in disciplining it. It takes the unstable history of competing cities and arranges it into a line. Eridu's place at the beginning helps make that line feel ancient and sacred. Once the first link is forged in a city of primordial prestige, the chain that follows becomes stronger. So Eridu is not important only because it is first. It is important because first is a form of power. Firstness gives authority a kind of innocence. It places kingship before later corruption, before rival claims, before the flood, before the world becomes complicated in the ways history is always complicated. To say that kingship began in Eridu is to give monarchy a sacred childhood. But no childhood remains untouched forever. As the list moves away from Eridu, the first city becomes less a setting than a shadow cast over everything that follows. Later cities will receive kingship. Later kings will rule for shorter spans. Later history will creep closer to ordinary human scale. Yet the origin remains behind them. Eridu, where the divine institution first came down, where two impossible kings held power in a time too large to enter directly. The mystery of Eridu is not whether every detail in the king list can be verified. It cannot. The mystery is why one of humanity's earliest written traditions wanted the beginning of power to be remembered there. And perhaps the answer is that Eridu gave kingship what every political system longs for, but rarely possesses: an origin older than argument, holier than ambition, and deep enough to make the present look like an inheritance rather than an invention. Chapter 7. The Flood That Divides History. Then the list breaks. Not physically, not in the sense of clay snapping in the hand, though many ancient tablets have suffered that fate. The break here is narrative, cosmic. The world of impossible reigns, sacred cities, and kings who stretch across tens of thousands of years reaches a boundary it cannot cross unchanged. The flood comes. The king list states it with a terrible simplicity. After the flood had swept over, kingship descended from heaven again. There is no long description of black water rising through streets. No catalogue of bodies, animals, boats, prayers, or collapsing houses. No attempt to make the disaster vivid in the way later storytellers might. The line is spare, almost administrative. But that restraint gives it force. The flood does not need decoration. It functions like a blade laid across time. Before it, kingship has already descended. cities have held it. 8 kings have ruled for spans so vast they seem to belong to a sacred age. Then the waters come, and history must begin again. That phrase, descended from heaven again, is crucial. It tells us that the flood did not merely interrupt kingship, it reset its relationship with the world. Authority had to be granted once more. The divine order was not assumed to have survived the catastrophe automatically. It had to re-enter human life. This is one of the most revealing moments in the entire text, because the flood is not just an event. It is a divider between two kinds of time. Before the flood, the rains are colossal. The cities feel like stations in a mythic landscape. The kings are named, but they remain distant, almost inhuman in scale. After the flood, the list begins moving toward a world that, while still exaggerated, gradually becomes more recognizable. The numbers shrink. The rulers become less like figures standing at the edge of creation, and more like kings who might have belonged to political memory. The flood creates that transition. In broader Mesopotamian tradition, the flood was not a minor story. It appears in different forms with different names and emphases across ancient texts. The details vary, and we should not flatten them into one single version. But the basic image is powerful. A catastrophic deluge that marks the end of an earlier world and the survival of a chosen remnant into a changed one. The King List does not retell that story in full. It assumes the flood as a known boundary, a fact of sacred memory. That assumption matters. The scribe does not pause to prove the flood. The text uses it as a hinge everyone is expected to understand. Something happened, or was believed to have happened, that made the world before fundamentally different from the world after. For historians, this raises difficult questions. Was the flood tradition rooted in real flooding events in southern Mesopotamia, where rivers, marshlands, and alluvial plains made water both life-giving and dangerous? Possibly, at least in part. Mesopotamia was a land shaped by water. Canals, river shifts, seasonal inundations, and destructive floods. It would not be surprising if memories of severe floods became magnified over generations. But the flood of the King List is not simply local weather remembered dramatically. It has become theological history. It divides existence into before and after. It gives the past a wound. It explains why the earliest age is inaccessible, why kingship had to be restored, why later rule stands at a distance from the first descent from heaven. The flood does not just destroy buildings, it changes the scale of time. This is where the King List's structure becomes more sophisticated than it may first appear. A less careful tradition might have placed the impossible kings in a vague golden age and left them there. But the King List gives that age a boundary. It encloses the impossible past behind catastrophe. It does not allow the tens of thousands of years to bleed casually into ordinary history. The flood contains them. That makes the impossible numbers easier to preserve. They belong to a world that is gone. Once the flood has swept over, no one has to explain why kings no longer rule for 36,000 years. The answer is built into the architecture of the story. The old order ended, kingship descended again, but the world that received it was not the same. There is a strange honesty in that. Not historical honesty in the modern documentary sense, where we demand evidence, dates, layers, and independent confirmation, but narrative honesty. The text knows there is a difference between the first age and later memory. It does not pretend they are identical. It marks the difference with disaster. Every civilization has ways of dividing time: before the war, after the fire, before the migration, after the conquest, before the empire, after the collapse. Human beings do not remember the past as a smooth line. We break it around trauma, transformation, and loss. The Sumerian King List does something similar, but on a sacred scale. The flood becomes the moment when the world's first order disappears beneath the waters, and the second order begins. That may help explain why flood traditions are so persistent. They speak to a fear older than writing, that everything human beings build can be undone by forces too large to negotiate with. Cities may organize life, kings may claim heaven's authority, scribes may press order into clay, but water ignores titles. It rises, and when it recedes, someone must explain why the world is still here. The King List's answer is direct. Kingship returned. This return is not a small matter. It means that catastrophe did not abolish divine order. The flood may have erased the first age, but it did not end the possibility of rule, civilization, or continuity. In fact, the text uses destruction to reinforce continuity. Kingship descends before the flood, then descends again after it. The institution survives precisely because its source is beyond the human world. That is a powerful political idea. A city can be destroyed. A dynasty can vanish. A ruler can die. But kingship, as a divine institution, can reappear. It can move. It can be renewed. It can survive the drowning of history itself. For later rulers and scribes, this was not merely comforting. It was useful. If kingship had crossed the flood, then any later king could claim a place in an order that had endured the greatest rupture imaginable. The throne was not just a human arrangement patched together after disaster. It was the return of heaven's design to a wounded earth. And yet, the flood also introduces unease. If kingship could be withdrawn once, or interrupted once, could it happen again? If divine order needed to descend again after catastrophe, then power was never entirely secure. It depended on forces beyond the palace. The King List presents authority as sacred, but not necessarily permanent in any single human place. The flood reminds every city that even divine favor has a history. That tension is part of the document's quiet power. It glorifies kingship while admitting that kingship has been broken. It elevates cities while remembering that cities can vanish. It presents order as heavenly while placing that order inside a world vulnerable to overwhelming change. The flood is therefore not just the end of the pre-flood kings. It is the reason the list can move forward. Without it, the transition from 241,200 years to more human scales would feel abrupt, almost embarrassing. With it, the change becomes meaningful. The world has passed through judgment, destruction, or cosmic reset. The text does not specify the mechanics here, and the age that follows must be different. So the waters in the King List do not simply cover the past. They preserve it by sealing it away. Behind them remain Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, Shurupak, and the 8 kings whose reigns belong to a lost order. Ahead lies a new descent of kingship, a new beginning, and a history that will slowly, unevenly, begin to resemble our own. The flood divides the list, but it also holds it together. Chapter 8. After the waters receded, after the flood, the world is not described as peaceful. It is described as ruled. That distinction matters. The King List does not pause over survivors rebuilding homes, draining fields, burying losses, or trying to make sense of a ruined landscape. It does not ask what ordinary people saw when the waters withdrew. Its attention turns immediately to kingship. The divine institution descends again, and the first post-flood city to receive it is Kish. The choice is important. Before the flood, kingship moved through cities whose names belong to the sacred horizon of beginnings. After the flood, the list begins to approach a world that feels less remote, not fully historical in the modern sense, not yet tidy, verifiable, or free from exaggeration, but closer. The air changes. The rains are still long, sometimes wildly long, but the scale begins to contract. Time, after the flood, becomes damaged into humanity. That may sound poetic, but it is also the structure of the text. The pre-flood kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, the numbers remain larger than life, yet they begin to move downward. The ancient world does not suddenly become realistic. It comes down gradually, as if memory itself needs time to adjust after passing through myth. This gradual descent is one of the most fascinating features of the King List. A modern historian might prefer a clean division. Everything before the flood is legend. Everything after it is history. The tablet refuses to cooperate. It gives us a more complicated movement, one in which myth thins slowly rather than disappearing at the waterline. That feels closer to how memory often works. Stories do not become historical all at once. They gather names, places, victories, family lines, ritual claims, political motives, and old exaggerations. A remembered ruler may absorb features from earlier figures. A real city may become the stage for a sacred pattern. A dynasty may compress itself around one famous name. In this kind of tradition, legend and record are not enemies. They are layers. The post-flood section begins with Kish, and Kish becomes a major name in the King List's imagination of authority. The phrase "King of Kish" later carried a prestige that seems to have reached beyond the city itself. It could imply a broader claim to dominance, or at least a status other rulers wanted to invoke. The King List's placement of Kish immediately after the flood gives that prestige deep roots. It makes Kish not merely powerful, but first in the restored world. Again, the political meaning is hard to miss. To be first after catastrophe is a different kind of honor from being first before it. Eridu receives the original descent. Kish receives the renewed descent. One belongs to primordial origin. The other belongs to survival, restoration, and the rebuilding of order after cosmic disruption. The text does not need to explain all of that. The sequence itself does the work, and yet, even after the waters recede, the King List remains strange. The early post-flood rulers still reign for lengths far beyond ordinary life. We are not suddenly in the world of sober annals and modest year counts. The list continues to magnify kingship, but now the magnification is less overwhelming. The rulers feel like they are beginning to emerge from the fog, though the fog has not lifted completely. This is where careless readings often go wrong. They assume that once the flood is over, the King List becomes straightforward history. It does not. The post-flood material still contains legendary rulers, exaggerated reigns, and political shaping. But the direction of travel matters. The document begins moving toward names and dynasties that can be discussed with more historical confidence later on. It is not a switch being flipped. It is a long dimming of mythic light. That dimming gives the list a peculiar authority. It does not ask us to step from fantasy into evidence in one clean motion. It guides us through an old mental landscape in which the first post-flood kings still belong partly to sacred time. Their world has survived the flood, but it has not become ordinary. Perhaps no world immediately after catastrophe ever does. To the people preserving this tradition, the renewed descent of kingship may have answered a deep cultural need. Catastrophe creates discontinuity. It threatens memory. It raises the possibility that everything before has been cut off, and everything after is merely improvised. The King List resists that fear. It says that after the flood, kingship returned according to divine order. The world was not left to begin from nothing. This is not just theology. It is the politics of continuity. A ruler who stands inside an unbroken sacred chain is stronger than one who appears by accident. A city that receives kingship after the flood is more than a local power. It becomes part of the restoration of the world. The list turned survival into legitimacy. But what did that mean for the people actually living in those cities? Here the silence grows heavy again. The King List records the movement of kingship, not the labor of recovery. It names rulers, not builders. It measures reigns, not hunger, grief, or reconstruction. If there were real memories of floods behind the tradition, the experience of ordinary survivors has been almost completely absorbed into royal chronology. That absence is not unique to Mesopotamia. Official histories often do this. They convert collective trauma into a story about authority. A disaster happens, and the record remembers who ruled afterward. The people who repaired canals, replanted fields, restored shrines, and carried children through mud rarely get names. The King List is no exception. And yet, its silence can still teach us something. By rushing back to kingship, the text reveals what mattered most to the tradition that shaped it. Order must be reestablished. The city must be placed again under a recognized authority. The chain must continue. Whatever the flood destroyed, the idea of rule had to survive. There is an almost haunting efficiency in that. The waters recede. Kingship descends. A city receives it. The list resumes. No lament. No explanation. No image of rebuilding. Just the restoration of the institution that makes history legible to the scribe. For modern readers, that can feel cold. But it may also be honest about how states remember. States do not usually preserve the past as ordinary people lived it. They preserve the past as authority needed it to be remembered. In the King List, the flood is not followed by democracy of memory. It is followed by a throne. Still, the post-flood world is not merely propaganda. It is also a bridge. It connects the sacred beginning to later political tradition. It allows the text to move from impossible antiquity toward the more crowded, contested world of Mesopotamian kings and cities. Without this bridge, the list would be two separate things, a myth of origins and a record of rulers. With it, they become one continuous story. That continuity may be the document's greatest ambition. It wants the first kings before the flood, the restored kings after the flood, and the later rulers of historical memory to belong to the same chain. It wants no gap where authority becomes merely human. Even as reigns shorten and names become more plausible, kingship remains something that descended, moved, and endured. After the waters receded, then, the world did not simply begin again. It was claimed again. That is the darker truth inside the calm sequence of names. A catastrophe may wipe away the old order, but the first story written afterward often belongs to those who can say that heaven has chosen them to rebuild it. Chapter 9. Myth Becoming Memory. The King List does not cross from myth into history through a doorway. It drifts. That is what makes it so difficult and so fascinating. There is no neat line where the impossible ends and the reliable begins. No ancient editor steps forward to tell us, from this point onward, the record may be trusted. Instead, the list moves by degrees, reigns shorten, cities become more familiar. Names begin to feel less like figures from a sacred horizon, and more like rulers who may have left traces in the political world. But myth does not vanish, it thins. This is where modern expectations can mislead us. We often want ancient texts to separate themselves into clean categories. Myth over here, history over there, religion in one box, politics in another. The King List seems almost indifferent to those boundaries. It places legendary kings and more historically plausible rulers within the same chain of succession, as though the passage from one to the other were natural. For the people who preserved it, perhaps it was. Memory does not begin as an archive. It begins as use. A community remembers what helps explain who they are, why their city matters, why their rulers deserve obedience, why the present has roots deeper than living witnesses can challenge. Some memories are factual, some are shaped, some are inherited from ritual, some are sharpened by politics. Over generations, they can settle together into a tradition that feels whole, even when its layers come from very different kinds of truth. The King List is one of those layered traditions. Its earliest kings belong to a pre-flood age measured on an impossible scale. Its later kings increasingly approach the world of dynasties, rival cities, and rulers whose names can sometimes be compared with other evidence. But in between, there is a long zone of ambiguity. Figures may be remembered, magnified, rearranged, or used to connect local traditions into a single line. A name may preserve something real while the reign attached to it remains symbolic. A city may be historically important, while its place in the sequence serves political design. That ambiguity is not a defect we can simply scrape away. It is part of the object we are studying. One of the most interesting features of the King List is that it does not appear embarrassed by its own mixture. It does not say, here are the sacred stories, and now here are the serious records, and the same format continues. Kingship moves, a ruler reigns, years are counted, another city receives authority. The list's calm structure gives continuity to material that modern readers would divide sharply. That calmness is powerful. It suggests that the scribal mind behind the text may have understood legitimacy as something that required both memory and myth. A king did not become meaningful only because he was recent enough to verify. He became meaningful because he could be placed within a grand pattern. The value of a ruler lay partly in his relationship to all who came before him, even if some of those predecessors belonged to a world where time had not yet become human-sized. This is why the transition matters more than any single name. The King List is not merely preserving a sequence. It is performing a transformation. It takes kings from the realm of sacred antiquity and gradually brings them into the realm of political memory. Along the way, it teaches the listener how to imagine history itself, not as a break from myth, but as myth slowly acquiring dates, cities, and dynasties. There is a lesson here about ancient historiography. Early historical writing was rarely just a neutral record of events. It was often a way of organizing meaning. The past had to be made useful. It had to explain the present. It had to show order where lived experience often provided conflict, interruption, and uncertainty. The King List does this with remarkable confidence. It turns a landscape of many cities into one succession. It turns discontinuity into transfer. It turns the flood from an ending into a hinge. And now, as the rulers become more recognizable, it turns legend into memory without ever admitting that the substance has changed. That may feel suspicious. It should. But suspicion does not require contempt. The list is not bad history simply because it fails to meet modern standards. It is evidence of an older way of making the past intelligible. It tells us how scribes and rulers wanted time to be shaped. It shows what kinds of continuity mattered to them. It reveals that history, at its earliest written edges, was already entangled with power. Power needs memory, but memory is rarely innocent. A ruler who can claim descent from a recent father has a family claim. A ruler who can claim connection to an ancient dynasty has a political claim. But a ruler whose office belongs to a chain beginning before the flood has something larger, a cosmic claim. He may still need soldiers, grain, alliances, and administrators. No amount of sacred history repairs a broken canal, but ideology can make obedience feel older than coercion. That is the genius of the King List. It does not simply say that kings ruled. It says kingship endured through cities, through catastrophe, through ages too large to verify. The institution continues. By the time the list approaches figures closer to historical memory, those figures are already standing inside a sacred corridor built behind them. This is where myth becomes politically useful memory. Not because everyone necessarily believed every number literally. We cannot know how every ancient reader or listener understood the text. But because the list offered a framework in which later rule could appear as the latest expression of something primordial. The farther back the chain stretched, the heavier it became. And yet, there is another possibility worth holding beside the political one. The King List may also reflect genuine wonder at antiquity. Ancient scribes lived among ruins, old mounds, inherited cults, and stories older than their own city's current fortunes. They knew, in their own way, that they were not first. They copied texts whose origins may already have been remote to them. They worked within traditions that had accumulated over centuries. The past was not dead. It was material. It could be recopied, reinterpreted, and placed into new arrangements. So when the King List blends myth and memory, it may not be only manipulating the past. It may also be trying to preserve a past that had already become difficult to separate into its original parts. That is a more human view of the scribe. Not a liar, not a modern historian, not a fantasy writer, a craftsman of inherited time. Someone working with traditions that carried authority precisely because they were old, even when their oldest layers could no longer be tested. Someone for whom the sacred and the historical did not cancel each other out. Someone who understood that a city's claim to greatness often depended on the stories it could attach to its name. The King List survives, in part, because it does not simplify that relationship. It lets us see a culture thinking with all its categories at once: divine order, political legitimacy, urban pride, scribal learning, ancestral memory, and mythic scale. To read it well, we must allow the transition to remain gradual. Some kings are almost certainly legendary. Some later rulers may stand closer to historical reality. Some names may sit uneasily between those poles. The list itself does not tell us exactly where to draw the line, and perhaps that uncertainty is one of its most honest features. The past does not always come to us sorted. Sometimes it arrives as a single clay surface holding several kinds of truth at once. The mythic kings tell us how power wanted to imagine its beginning. The more historical kings tell us how power wanted to remember its inheritance. Between them lies the strange middle country where civilization first learns to turn story into chronology. And that middle country is where the King List becomes more than an ancient curiosity. It becomes a warning about every official past ever written. Once memory has been arranged into a list, we must ask not only what it preserves, but what purpose that preservation served. Chapter 10. The Kings Who Needed the Past. A king does not only rule the present, he argues with the past. Every throne has this problem. It may be carved from wood, raised on a platform, guarded by soldiers, blessed by priests, or surrounded by scribes. But it still rests on a question that never fully goes away. Why this ruler, in this place, at this time? Force can answer that question for a while. Wealth can help. Victory can silence objections, at least until the next defeat. But no ruler wants to look like an accident. No dynasty wants to appear as a brief interruption between two uncertainties. Power prefers to seem inevitable. It wants ancestors. It wants continuity. It wants the present to feel like the latest chapter of something ancient, not the temporary success of someone with enough men and grain. This is where the Sumerian King List becomes more than a strange record of impossible reigns. It becomes useful. Later rulers and scribes did not preserve lists like this simply because they enjoyed old names. They preserved them because the past had political weight. A chronology could be a weapon, though not the loud kind. It did not need to break walls. It could do quieter work, arranging memory so that authority appeared orderly, ancient, and divinely sanctioned. The King List offers exactly that kind of order. It tells us that kingship descended from heaven. It moves from city to city. It survives the flood. It passes through ages of mythic vastness and gradually approaches more recognizable political memory. By the time a later ruler sees himself in relation to such a tradition, he is not merely one more ambitious man in a crowded Mesopotamian world. He can imagine himself as standing within a chain that began before ordinary history. That is an extraordinary inheritance to claim. Of course, the real world behind the list was far messier. Mesopotamia was not governed by one serene, unbroken kingship that politely relocated whenever divine order changed address. It was a landscape of rival cities, shifting alliances, warfare, diplomacy, temple interests, dynastic ambition, local pride, and economic pressure. Authority did not simply float from one city to another like a sacred lamp being carried in procession. It was contested. The King List knows how to make that contest look calm. That may be its most political achievement. It takes a world of broken successions and makes them seem sequential. It takes rivalry and turns it into transfer. It takes local victories and frames them as moments in a larger divine pattern. This does not mean every scribe who copied the list was consciously producing propaganda in the crude sense. Ancient scribal culture was more complicated than that. Copying a venerable text could be an act of education, preservation, tradition, and intellectual discipline. But the content of the list still carries ideology, whether or not every copyist paused to admire it. The past it creates is not neutral. It is royal past. Ordinary people appear only indirectly, if at all. The canals, fields, workshops, and households that made kingship possible remain mostly outside the frame. The list remembers power by naming those who held it, or those whom tradition said had held it. This is how official memory often works. It turns society into succession. It makes the throne the spine of time. And for kings, that spine was valuable. Imagine a ruler in a city that has recently gained dominance. His victory may be real. His army may be feared. His administrators may be competent. But recent power is fragile because everyone remembers that it was recent. Rivals can say, "You rose yesterday." Subjects can remember other houses. Neighboring cities can point to older traditions. The new ruler needs more than success. He needs depth. A list like this provides depth. It says kingship has always moved. No city holds it forever by natural right. If it has now come to your city, that transfer is not a scandal. It is how the world has worked since before the flood. What looks like political change becomes sacred continuity. There is a subtle brilliance in that argument. The King List does not need to deny instability. Instead, it absorbs instability into its pattern. Cities rise and lose kingship. Dynasties appear and disappear. The institution remains. By making movement normal, the list protects the idea of kingship from the embarrassment of political change. A fallen city does not disprove divine order. It simply means kingship has gone elsewhere. That kind of thinking would have been extremely useful in a region where power often shifted. But the list does something else as well. It gives later rulers a way to borrow the prestige of cities older than their own dominance. Even if a ruler's immediate dynasty was new, the institution he claimed was not. The line behind him stretched through Kish, through Shuruppak, through Sippar, through Eridu, and beyond the flood into the age of impossible kings. The chain made present authority feel less lonely. This is one reason the pre-flood section matters politically, even though it is the least literal part of the document. The impossible past enlarges the possible present. If the beginning of kingship had been ordinary, later rulers would inherit an ordinary institution. But if kingship began in heaven, passed through sacred cities, endured catastrophe, and carried memories older than any living challenge, then the ruler who claims it receives more than office. He receives aura. That aura could not feed a city by itself. It could not guarantee justice, defend walls, or stop drought. Ancient people were not incapable of noticing bad rulers simply because royal ideology existed. But ideology shapes the terms by which power explains itself. It gives obedience a story. It gives hierarchy a sacred grammar. The King List is part of that grammar. At the same time, it would be too simple to say that the list was only a tool for kings. Scribes had their own reasons to preserve such a text. A list of rulers was a way of organizing time, teaching tradition, displaying learning, and connecting the present to revered antiquity. Scribal culture valued copying, ordering, and transmitting inherited knowledge. The King List may reflect not just royal ambition, but the scribal desire to make the past legible. Still, the legibility it offers is selective. It is not the legibility of a marketplace, where people argue over weights and prices, not the legibility of a household, where inheritance disputes and marriages shape daily survival, not the legibility of labor, where thousands of unnamed workers make royal projects possible. It is the legibility of succession. Who held kingship? Where did it go? How long did it remain? Those are the questions the list chooses to answer. And every chosen question leaves other questions in darkness. This is why the King List must be read as both memory and argument. It preserves traditions that may reach into deep antiquity, but it also arranges them in a way that serves a particular vision of power. It does not merely remember kings. It explains why kingship should be seen as one continuous, divinely ordered institution, despite the obvious fragmentation of Mesopotamian political life. The kings who needed the past were not unusual. Every age has rulers who search backward for legitimacy. They claim founders, golden ages, sacred mandates, heroic ancestors, restored traditions. They build monuments, sponsor chronicles, rename victories, and polish old stories until they reflect the present regime in a flattering light. The Sumerian King List is older than many of those later habits, but it belongs to the same human instinct. Power wants memory to kneel, and yet the tablet also outlived the rulers who needed it. That is the irony. A document that may have helped kings imagine eternal legitimacy now survives as evidence of how fragile legitimacy really was. If power had been obvious, no one would have needed such a grand chain to explain it. The very effort to stretch kingship back before the flood suggests an anxiety beneath the confidence. A ruler who claims heaven may still fear history, and the King List, with all its impossible years, gives us a rare view of that fear turned into chronology. Chapter 11. A single kingship, many rival cities. The King List has a strange habit of making conflict look orderly. Kingship is in one city. Then it is in another. Then another. The movement appears almost clean, as if authority were a sacred object being lifted from one temple and placed carefully in the next. Eridu holds it. Bad Tibira receives it. Later, after the flood, Kish receives it. Then the line continues through other cities, each given its moment beneath the sign of legitimate rule. On the surface, this looks like chronology. Underneath, it looks more like an argument, because Mesopotamia was not a single unified kingdom for most of its early history. It was a landscape of competing city-states, each with its own god, temple traditions, ruling houses, fields, canals, grudges, ambitions, and memories of greatness. A city could rise through military force, economic strength, religious prestige, or a fortunate alignment of political circumstances. Another could decline because its canals shifted, its rivals grew stronger, its dynasty failed, or its claims simply stopped persuading enough people. The real map was crowded. The King List makes it linear. That is one of the document's most revealing contradictions. It presents kingship as singular, as though there could only be one true bearer of the institution at a time. Yet the world behind the text was often plural. More than one ruler could claim power. More than one city could flourish. More than one local tradition could insist that its own past mattered most. The list does not deny the existence of many cities. It names them, but it denies them simultaneity, or at least, it pushes simultaneity out of view. This is a quiet but powerful move. If several cities were powerful at the same time, history becomes messy. The question, who ruled, becomes difficult. Ruled whom? For how long? Recognized by which city? Enforced by whose army? Accepted by which temple? Remembered by which scribal tradition? Political reality turns into a tangled net of local answers. The King List cuts that net into a single thread. This does not make it worthless. It makes it interesting. The document is not simply failing to describe reality. It is reshaping reality according to an idea. That kingship is one, even when cities are many. Authority may move, but it does not multiply. There is a single legitimate current flowing through time, and the list claims to know where that current rested. For later rulers, that idea was enormously useful. If your city appeared in the line, your power could be imagined as part of the official sequence of the world. If your rival's claims did not fit the line, they became easier to diminish. The structure itself decides what counts. This is political ideology disguised as chronology, not disguised in the sense of a crude lie hidden behind a mask. Ancient scribes may not have thought in our modern categories of objective record versus propaganda, but the effect is still ideological. The list teaches its audience to imagine authority in a particular way, centralized in meaning, even when decentralized in reality. That difference matters. A city-state world produces many memories. A royal list produces one memory. To create one memory from many is not a neutral act. It requires selection. It requires omission. It requires arranging rival traditions so that they no longer compete on equal terms. The King List does this by turning political rivalry into succession. Instead of saying, these cities struggled with one another, it says, kingship passed from one to the next. The violence disappears, so does negotiation. So do the awkward overlaps, local loyalties, and failed claims that must have filled real political life. What remains is elegant, perhaps too elegant. That elegance should make us cautious. Whenever a historical document makes power look smoother than human beings usually make it, we should ask who benefits from the smoothing. In the King List, the beneficiaries are not hard to imagine. Kings gain a sacred genealogy. Cities gain moments of cosmic importance. Scribes gain a teachable structure through which the chaos of the past becomes ordered. But the cost is complexity. The list's single kingship may have comforted those who wanted history to be readable. It may have given later regimes a way to explain why authority had moved without admitting the full disorder of political change. But it also hides the reality that Mesopotamian civilization was built not by one line of kingship, but by many centers interacting, borrowing, competing, and remembering themselves differently. There is another subtle point here. By portraying kingship as something that moves from city to city, the list does not give any one city permanent possession. Even Eridu, the first receiver of kingship, eventually loses it. Kish, honored after the flood, does not keep it forever. The institution is single, but no city owns it eternally. That is both stabilizing and destabilizing. It stabilizes kingship as an idea. No matter what happens, kingship continues, but it destabilizes every individual city's claim. If kingship can leave Eridu, it can leave anyone. If heaven's grant can move, then the city that possesses it today may become tomorrow's memory. For a political text, that is a dangerous truth to preserve. Perhaps the danger is softened by the list's tone. It does not dramatize the departures. It does not linger on humiliation. It presents transfer as order, not loss. In doing so, it protects the institution from the failures of its holders. A city may fall away from the line, but kingship itself remains pure, because kingship was never merely the property of one place. This may be why the document could serve different political imaginations over time. A dominant city could see itself as the current vessel of heaven's authority. A rising city could see the movement of kingship as precedent for its own ascent. A scribe could use the sequence to impose coherence on a past that might otherwise be impossible to teach in a single line. Everyone gets something from the fiction of order, and yet, the fiction never fully erases the truth. The very number of cities in the list reminds us of fragmentation. If power had truly been simple, the list would not need to move so often. Its sequence is a monument to continuity, but also an admission of instability. Kingship passes from place to place because no city can hold history still. That may be the most human thing about this strange document. It wants unity, but it preserves rivalry's shadow. It wants divine order, but it records political movement. It wants a single chain, but the chain is made of many competing cities. The Sumerian King List asks us to see kingship as one line descending through time. Archaeology and history ask us to remember that the world beneath that line was full of noise, canal disputes, temple wealth, border conflicts, alliances, local gods, family ambitions, labor obligations, and all the ordinary pressures that official chronology prefers not to name. So the contradiction is not a mistake to be solved and thrown away. It is the clue. The list tells us how power wanted to be remembered, as a sacred sequence. The cities remind us how power was lived, as competition. Between those two truths, the clay tablet becomes more than a record of kings. It becomes an early example of something that has never left political life. The attempt to turn a fractured world into a single story and then call that story history. Chapter 12. The Scribe Behind the Clay. It is tempting to imagine the Sumerian King List as a voice from the beginning, a tablet lying quietly in the ancient dark, a record from the first cities, a message pressed into clay by someone standing close to the birth of kingship itself. But that image is too simple. The King List, as we have it, is not a single untouched statement from the dawn of civilization. It is a scribal artifact. It passed through hands. It was copied, taught, arranged, and preserved within a culture where writing was not casual. Clay did not receive words by accident. Someone had to prepare it, shape it, hold it, impress signs into its surface, and decide that these names, these cities, these reigns, and this sequence mattered enough to endure. Before we ask what the list tells us about kings, we should pause over the person who made the list possible. The scribe. Not one scribe only, of course. The tradition likely reflects generations of copying and reshaping. That is part of its mystery. A tablet can look like a fixed object, but the text behind it may have lived a long life before that particular copy was made. In ancient Mesopotamia, scribes learned through repetition. They copied signs, lexical lists, hymns, legal formulas, administrative records, and literary compositions. Writing was a craft, but also a discipline of memory. To copy was not merely to duplicate. It was to enter a tradition. That matters for the King List because the document feels orderly enough to appear official, yet layered enough to suggest a history of revision. A simple record says, "Here is what happened." And the King List seems to say, "Here is how the past must be arranged so that it makes sense." Those are not the same thing. The scribal world that preserved such a text was deeply invested in order. Lists were not minor tools in Mesopotamian intellectual life. They were a way of mastering reality. To list something was to classify it, stabilize it, make it teachable. Animals, professions, places, gods, words, measures, and rulers could all be organized through writing. The list form itself carried authority. It made the world look as though it could be known. The King List belongs to that habit, but it applies it to time. Imagine the task. A scribe sits before a lump of clay, not trying to write a lively biography, not telling stories around a fire, not staging dramatic speeches, but compressing centuries of political tradition into a structured sequence. The result is austere. Names, cities, reigns, transfers of kingship, catastrophe, renewal. More names, more cities. It is almost emotionless. And that is part of its power. The restraint makes the impossible feel official. A wild legend spoken aloud may invite skepticism. A wild legend written in the format of a chronicle gains a different texture. The list does not beg us to believe. It simply records. Its confidence is created by form. But form can conceal labor. Every sequence requires choices. Which rulers are included? Which are omitted? How are overlapping traditions handled? How are local city memories stitched into one line? What happens when different versions disagree? We do not need to imagine a single editor sitting down with a modern sense of authorship and inventing everything from scratch. The process may have been much slower, more cumulative, and more traditional than that, but choices were still made. Whether consciously, habitually, or by the authority of inherited school texts, a copied tradition is not free from interpretation. Even preservation can reshape. A scribe copying an older list may regularize numbers, adjust names, adopt the version favored in his school, or preserve contradictions without resolving them. Another scribe, in another place, might inherit a slightly different sequence. Over time, the text becomes not one voice, but a controlled chorus. The clay tablet gives the impression of unity, but beneath it are layers of transmission. This is why we should not treat the King List as a transparent window. It is more like a polished surface reflecting several things at once: old memories, royal ideology, scribal training, theological assumptions, and the intellectual pleasure of order. When we look into it, we are not seeing the past untouched. We are seeing the past after it has been made legible by writing. And writing changes memory. Oral tradition can bend, expand, contract, and adapt with each telling. Writing does not stop that process completely, but it changes its rhythm. Once words are pressed into clay, they gain weight. They can be copied across generations. They can be taught as authoritative. They can survive long after the political world that produced them has fallen apart. The scribe, then, is not just a recorder. He is a gatekeeper of what becomes durable. That durability creates an illusion we must resist. Because something is ancient does not mean it is original. Because something is written does not mean it is neutral. Because something is formal does not mean it is factual in the way we want it to be. The King List is valuable precisely because it is crafted. Its arrangement tells us how the scribal imagination wanted to discipline the past. There is a human tension here. The scribe's work feels humble. Press the sign, copy the name, count the years, repeat the formula. But the effect is enormous. Through such labor, cities rise and fall in memory. Kings gain or lose their place in the chain. The flood becomes a dividing line. Heaven becomes the source of political order. A fractured past becomes a single sequence. The person behind this clay may not have wielded a sword, but he shaped the afterlife of kings. That is not a small power. We should also remember that scribes were not outside society, looking down like modern analysts. They worked within institutions, temples, palaces, schools, administrative households. Their training and employment tied them to the structures that needed records, legitimacy, and continuity. This does not make them dishonest. It makes them historical. They wrote from within a world where power, religion, economy, and learning were connected. So when a scribal tradition preserves kingship as a divine institution moving through cities, we should hear both reverence and utility. The text may sincerely reflect inherited belief. It may also serve the needs of political order. In ancient writing, those two functions could live together without contradiction. That is one reason the King List feels so hard to modernize. We want to peel it apart. The mythic layer, the historical layer, the ideological layer, the mathematical layer. Analysis requires that, and we should do it carefully. But the scribe did not necessarily experience the text as a pile of separable parts. He may have received it as tradition, authoritative because it had been copied, meaningful because it was old, useful because it ordered the world. There is something quietly moving about that. A human hand pressed impossible years into clay, not knowing that thousands of years later, those marks would be read by people living under clocks, satellites, databases, and histories written with footnotes. The scribe did not write for us. He wrote within his own system of meaning. Yet his work survived long enough to confront us with a different way of imagining time. The King List is often discussed for its kings, but without scribes, the kings would have vanished into air. The clay preserved them. The school tradition shaped them. The list form disciplined them. And the scribe, anonymous to us, became the quiet architect of their immortality. That may be the final irony of this tablet. It was designed to preserve rulers, but it also preserves the mind of the people who wrote about rulers. Their love of order, their fear of rupture, their respect for sacred beginnings, and their willingness to let myth and memory share the same line of text. Behind every impossible king stands a very real scribe. And behind the scribe stands a civilization learning that whoever controls the written past can give shape to the future's imagination. Chapter 13, Gods, Men, and the Shape of Time. The earliest kings in the Sumerian King List do not feel entirely human. They have names. They are attached to cities. They appear in a sequence that resembles political history. But their reigns belong to a scale so vast that they seem to stand somewhere between mankind and the divine. They are not presented as ordinary gods descending openly into the world, yet they are not convincing as ordinary men either. They occupy the borderland. That borderland is one of the most important spaces in ancient imagination. Many early societies did not picture the first ages as merely old. They pictured them as closer to the gods, and therefore different in substance. The beginning of things was not just earlier on a timeline. It was heavier, brighter, stranger, more charged with sacred power. Later generations lived farther from the source. The world had cooled. The King List expresses that feeling through time. To us, time is usually a neutral container. Years pass at the same speed whether a king is wise or foolish, whether a city is holy or corrupt, whether a god is honored or ignored. We measure time with clocks and calendars, and we expect one year to behave like another. The King List does not seem interested in that kind of equality. Its earliest age is enormous. Kings reign for tens of thousands of years. The flood comes, and the world after it becomes smaller. The list gradually moves toward more human proportions. Time itself appears to contract as history approaches the present. This does not mean the Sumerians had no practical sense of time. Quite the opposite. Agricultural life, temple service, labor obligations, and administration all required careful attention to seasons, months, deliveries, and deadlines. A scribe who could record grain rations was not confused about ordinary duration. But sacred time is not the same as administrative time. A field needs a calendar. A mythic origin needs magnitude. The antediluvian kings belong to that magnitude. They are placed at the beginning of kingship, when divine authority first descends into human cities. Their impossible reigns tell the listener that the first world operated under different conditions. The earliest rulers were not simply longer-lived men. They were signs that the age itself was larger. This is where the boundary between gods and men becomes blurred. Ancient Mesopotamian religion included gods with distinct personalities, powers, and cities of special devotion. Human rulers in most periods were not casually identical with those gods. We should not flatten everything into the claim that every king was worshipped as divine in the same way. The evidence is more varied than that. But kingship itself carried sacred force. A ruler could be chosen, favored, appointed, protected, or legitimized by divine powers. He could maintain temples, sponsor rituals, enforce justice, and represent the city's proper order. His role had political muscle, but also theological weight. In that world, the king was not merely a manager of people. He was part of the structure by which earth remained aligned with heaven. The first kings exaggerate that role until it becomes almost cosmic. Their reigns are too long for biography because they are not primarily biographical figures. They are embodiments of an age. They show what kingship looked like when it was nearest to its divine source. Vast, stable, remote, and difficult to question. This may also explain why the early rulers feel so empty as characters. The list does not tell us whether Alulim was generous, cruel, beloved, feared, brilliant, or incompetent. It does not need him to be psychologically interesting. His function is not to let us know the man. His function is to mark the beginning of sacred order. A modern documentary audience often wants personality. Ancient royal ideology often wanted position. That difference matters. A king in this list is not remembered because he had a compelling inner life. He is remembered because kingship rested in him, or through him, for a span of time that gave the institution weight. The individual is almost swallowed by the office. The man disappears into the shape of time. And perhaps that is exactly how the list wants it. The boundary between human and divine is not blurred here through dramatic miracles. It is blurred through scale. The first kings are named like men, but measured like beings from another order. They inhabit cities, but their reigns stretch across durations that make normal city life unimaginable. They belong to earth, but their authority begins in heaven. That tension creates a worldview very different from ours. Modern readers tend to ask, were they real? The King List seems to answer, or perhaps evade the question, by saying, they were necessary. Necessary for what? Necessary to make kingship older than ordinary memory. Necessary to explain why rule was sacred before it was contested. Necessary to give later history a deep foundation. Necessary to imagine a time when the gods were nearer and the world had not yet been diminished by catastrophe. The flood, in this sense, is not only a disaster, it is a change in scale. Before it, the world can hold kings of impossible duration. After it, kingship returns, but under altered conditions. The same divine institution descends again, yet the age that receives it is smaller, less stable, closer to the human world we recognize. This shrinking of time may reflect a common ancient intuition, that the present is a reduced version of a greater beginning. Many cultures imagine a first age more powerful than the current one. The ancestors were stronger. The gods walked nearer. The rules were different. The world was young, and youth was not innocence so much as intensity. The King List gives that intuition a bureaucratic form. That is what makes it so unusual. It does not tell a long mythic story about golden ancestors feasting with the gods. It lists reigns. It counts. It makes sacred time look administrative. The result is strangely compelling. A cosmic worldview written in the calm language of record-keeping. Here, gods, men, and time are not separate ideas. They interlock. The gods grant kingship. Men receive it. Time expands around the first receivers, then narrows after catastrophe. Political order becomes a reflection of cosmic order, and chronology becomes a theological statement. This does not prove that the first kings were divine beings. It does not prove that humans once lived for tens of thousands of years. It does not unlock a secret literal history hidden beneath the numbers. A careful reading has to resist those temptations, but it does reveal something profound. The people who preserved this tradition did not imagine power beginning in a small way. They imagined it entering the world from above, resting in sacred cities, embodied by rulers who belonged to an age larger than ours. Whether or not those kings ever lived as individuals, they lived as explanations, and explanations can rule the mind long after empires fall. The King List's earliest rulers stand at the meeting point of theology, memory, and political need. They are too human to be simple gods, too impossible to be ordinary kings, and too important to dismiss as fantasy. They are figures of sacred scale. Through them, the Sumerian imagination shaped time itself into a hierarchy. At the top stood the gods. Below them, the first kings, immense and remote. Below them, the later rulers, still grand but increasingly human. And beneath all of it, the people whose lives moved in ordinary days, whose labor sustained the cities, and whose names rarely reached the clay. The King List looks upward toward heaven and kingship, but if we listen carefully, we can sense the world below it too. The human world, measuring seed, water, hunger, and work, while its rulers were placed inside a time vast enough to touch the divine. Chapter 14. What the King List hides. Every official history has a shadow. Not because it is always false, and not because the people who wrote it were incapable of honesty. The shadow exists because no record can preserve everything. Every act of writing selects. Every list makes a choice. Every clean sequence leaves a mess outside the frame. The Sumerian King List is no different. It gives us kings, cities, reigns, transfers of authority, a flood, and the repeated descent of kingship from heaven. It gives us a world organized from above, but it tells us almost nothing about the people below that structure, the people whose hands made kingship possible in the first place. We do not hear the canal workers. We do not hear the women grinding grain, managing households, brewing beer, raising children, mourning the dead, arranging marriages, and keeping the daily machinery of life from collapsing. We do not hear the merchants arguing over goods, the farmers measuring water, the laborers hauling mud brick, the priests negotiating temple obligations, or the families who lived through the rise and fall of rulers whose names became permanent while theirs vanished. This silence is not accidental in the sense of a simple oversight. It is built into the genre. A king list is designed to remember kings. Its purpose is narrow, even when its implications are enormous. It turns the past into a chain of rulership, and once the past becomes a chain, everything that does not look like a link disappears. That is why the document can feel so majestic and so incomplete at the same time. It preserves an ancient vision of order, but order is not the same as life. Real Mesopotamian cities were complicated organisms. They depended on irrigation, food distribution, temple economies, craft production, trade, labor organization, taxation, religious service, and negotiation between powerful institutions. A king could claim heaven, but he still needed grain. He still needed workers. He still needed scribes to calculate, priests to legitimize, soldiers to enforce, and households to endure the consequences of decisions made above them. The King List does not show us that machinery. It shows us the crown. And a crown is always a summary that flatters itself. This is one of the most important ways to read the list with care. Its omissions are not empty spaces, they are clues. They reveal what kind of past the text wanted to create. The absence of ordinary people tells us that the list is not trying to describe society as a whole. It is trying to describe legitimacy. It remembers cities only when kingship resides there. It remembers rulers not because they represent every aspect of life, but because they serve as vessels of the institution the text cares about most. That focus gives the list power, but also distortion. Take the movement of kingship from city to city. On the clay, it looks almost seamless. Authority rests here, then there. A dynasty ends, another begins. The flood comes, kingship descends again. The structure is calm. But real transitions of power are rarely calm for the people living through them. A change in dominance could mean war, tribute, forced labor, damaged fields, broken alliances, new officials, revised obligations, or the destruction of local prestige. The King List absorbs all of that into a line. It does not say who resisted. It does not say who paid. It does not say which families gained from a new ruler and which were ruined by him. It does not tell us whether a city celebrated the arrival of kingship or survived it with gritted teeth. The list is too dignified for such details, or perhaps too interested in dignity to admit them. There is also the matter of succession. The document presents reigns as if power can be counted cleanly. One ruler, then another, then another. But dynastic politics are rarely that neat. Behind a royal name there may have been court struggles, rival heirs, assassinations, marriages, temple factions, military support, foreign pressure, and deals that no official list wanted to preserve. The surface of chronology can make power look lawful after the fact. That is one of official history's oldest tricks. It does not always lie directly. Sometimes it simply begins after the struggle is over. By the time a name appears in a list, the violence that made the name possible has often been edited into silence. A reign length replaces the argument over how the reign began. A city name replaces the question of how that city gained dominance. A divine descent replaces the human negotiations that allowed authority to function. This does not mean the King List has no historical value. It has great value. But part of that value lies in showing us the limits of elite memory. It reveals how rulers and scribes imagined political time, while also reminding us how much lived experience did not fit that imagination. The list hides the economy behind kingship. It hides the conflict behind succession. It hides the local traditions that may have been flattened into a single sequence. It hides the labor that built the temples, maintained the canals, filled the storehouses, and gave rulers something to rule. Most of all, it hides uncertainty. The King List speaks with confidence. That confidence can be seductive. Names and numbers have a way of making the past look settled. But ancient traditions were often contested, layered, and revised. Different cities could preserve different memories. Different scribal schools could transmit different versions. The version that survives may not represent a universal agreement. It may represent a successful arrangement of memory. And success is not the same as completeness. There is something almost modern about this problem. We still live among official timelines that simplify confusion into order. We still see nations, institutions, dynasties, companies, and movements tell their own pasts through founders, milestones, victories, and carefully chosen turning points. The form changes. The habit remains. Power often prefers history with clean edges. The Sumerian King List gives us one of the early forms of that habit. It is not only a record of what was remembered, it is a record of what could be left out and still allow the story to feel complete. That may be its most revealing silence. Because if you remove ordinary people from history, kingship can appear to descend untouched from heaven. If you include them, kingship becomes something else as well, a system sustained by labor, belief, pressure, fear, cooperation, and habit. The divine story does not disappear, but it becomes entangled with human effort. The King List wants us to look upward. A fuller history asks us to look sideways, toward the scribe's school, toward the temple storeroom, toward the canal bank, toward the house where a family hears that kingship has moved to another city and wonders what that will mean for taxes, safety, food, and sons old enough to be taken for labor or war. Those people are not named in the list, but they are the ground beneath it. Without them, the cities before the flood are only sacred names. Without them, Kish and Uruk and the later centers of power are only entries in a sequence. Without them, kingship descends into emptiness. So what does the King List hide? It hides the world that made it possible. And once we notice that, the tablet becomes more complicated and more human. Its grandeur remains. Its mystery remains. But beneath the impossible years and divine transfers, we begin to sense a crowded civilization, not as the list presents it, but as it must have been. Noisy, unequal, inventive, anxious, devout, ambitious, and alive. The kings received the clay. The people carried the weight. Chapter 15. Why the Impossible Survived. The easiest thing to say about the Sumerian King List is that its numbers are wrong. That is also the least interesting thing to say. Of course, the pre-flood reigns are impossible if we read them as literal human lifespans. No careful interpretation requires us to pretend otherwise. A king does not sit on a throne for 36,000 years. A court does not function unchanged for tens of millennia around one man. Cities do not pass through that kind of time without becoming something else entirely. But the numbers survived. That is the real mystery. Not merely that someone once wrote them down, but that scribes continued to preserve them. They were copied into a tradition that valued order, learning, and textual authority. They were not quietly corrected into sensible figures. They were not trimmed down to human scale. They remained vast, formal, and impossible. So we have to ask a better question. What did these impossible numbers do that ordinary numbers could not? One answer is that they protected distance. The earliest kings needed to belong to a world no living person could challenge. If a ruler had reigned for 40 years, someone might compare him to a grandfather's memory. If a dynasty had lasted a few centuries, rival traditions might compete with it. But tens of thousands of years place the first kings beyond argument. They are not recent enough to be disputed in ordinary ways. They stand in sacred distance. Distance is useful. It makes the beginning feel pure. It separates the first age from the compromised politics of the present. It lets later rulers look backward to a time before rivalry appeared messy, before succession looked suspicious, before cities competed openly for dominance. The impossible number turns political origin into mythic foundation. But that is only part of it. The long reigns also make kingship feel stable. In the world before the flood, authority does not flicker from one short-lived ruler to another. It endures. It stretches across unimaginable spans. Even when kingship moves from city to city, it does so within a rhythm of vast duration. The institution appears older, stronger, and more deeply rooted than any single human life. That stability would have mattered in a region where actual political life was often unstable. The gap between ideology and experience is important here. People living in Mesopotamian cities knew that rulers died. Dynasties failed, cities fought, fortunes shifted, canals changed course, enemies arrived, temples gained and lost influence. The daily world did not always look like divine order. Perhaps that is exactly why a text like the King List mattered. It did not mirror instability. It answered it. It said, beneath all this movement, there is a pattern. The impossible reigns are part of that answer. They stretch the pattern backward until it becomes older than disorder itself. This is where we must be careful with the word truth. Modern readers often treat truth as a narrow category. A statement is either factually accurate or it is false. That distinction matters especially when we are trying to reconstruct the past. But ancient texts often worked with several kinds of truth at once. A number could be mathematically meaningful, theologically expressive, politically useful, and historically anchored to a real place, even if it was not literally true as a lifespan. That does not make the number meaningless. It makes it dangerous to read too quickly. The long reigns may have expressed a worldview in which the first age was larger than the present, closer to the gods, and therefore measured differently. They may have used the authority of arithmetic to give shape to sacred time. They may have preserved fragments of older local traditions, enlarged through copying and interpretation. They may have helped later rulers imagine themselves as heirs of an order that began before the flood. None of these possibilities requires us to believe the numbers literally, but all of them help explain why the numbers were worth preserving. There is also a scribal reason. Once a tradition becomes authoritative, its strangeness can become part of its authority. A later copyist may not feel free to fix what has been handed down. In cultures of textual transmission, preservation itself can be an act of respect. The older and stranger a line appears, the more carefully it may be copied. Not because everyone understands it perfectly, but because it belongs to the inherited form. Sometimes the impossible survives because it is too important to alter. That may sound paradoxical, but it is familiar. We still preserve old formulas, ceremonial phrases, archaic spellings, symbolic numbers, and inherited stories long after their original meanings have become difficult to explain. We keep them because changing them would feel like breaking continuity. The past often survives not as clarity, but as reverence. The King List may have carried that kind of reverence. Its numbers were part of the structure. To reduce them would not merely make the text more realistic. It would change the scale of the first world. It would make the earliest kings smaller. It would pull sacred origin down into ordinary time. And the list seems determined not to do that. The impossibility, then, is not an embarrassment hidden in the text. It is one of the text's central tools. It tells the listener that the beginning of kingship cannot be measured by the same expectations that govern later rulers. It marks the first age as separate, immense, and divinely charged. It turns chronology into theology. At the same time, the numbers serve politics. A ruler who inherits a kingship traced through impossible antiquity receives a deeper legitimacy than one whose authority begins yesterday. The long reigns help make power look ancient enough to deserve obedience. They suggest that kingship is not a temporary arrangement among humans, but an institution woven into the oldest structure of the world. This does not mean the list was cynical. That is another modern trap. We often assume that if a story serves power, it must have been knowingly fabricated. But belief and usefulness are not opposites. A tradition can be sincerely preserved and politically convenient at the same time. The scribes who copied the King List may have seen no contradiction between sacred memory and royal legitimacy. In their world, those ideas belong together. The impossible survived because it sat at that crossing point. It was not simple error. If it had been only error, it would be less interesting. It survived because it expressed something the culture needed the beginning of history to say. That power came from above. That cities received it in order. That catastrophe interrupted but did not abolish it. And that the present stood within a chain far older than any living ruler. The long reigns are not reliable biography. They are symbolic architecture. They hold up the ceiling of the story. Remove them, and the king list becomes more reasonable, but also smaller. The pre-flood age loses its vastness. The first kings become merely early rulers, not figures of sacred time. The flood becomes less of a cosmic rupture. The descent of kingship from heaven loses some of its terrifying scale. The numbers are impossible because the role they play is impossible to perform with ordinary years. They do not tell us how long the first kings lived. They tell us how ancient authority wanted to feel. And that feeling, immense, remote, divine, orderly, and unreachable, was powerful enough to survive on clay long after the kings themselves, real or legendary, had disappeared from the earth. Chapter 16. The Shadow of the First Kings. So we return to the impossible number. 8 kings, 5 cities, more than 240,000 years before the flood. It is tempting to finish by solving it neatly, as if the Sumerian King List were a locked box, and all we needed was the right key. But some ancient mysteries are not solved by reducing them to one explanation. They are understood by seeing why they had to be shaped the way they were. The first kings were not preserved because they fit ordinary history. They were preserved because they gave history a sacred beginning. The King List tells us that power did not simply emerge from ambition, violence, wealth, or administrative skill, though real kingship surely depended on all of those things. It tells us that kingship descended from heaven. It entered named cities. It endured through ages too vast for human life. It was broken by the flood, then granted again. And from that renewed descent, later rulers could imagine themselves as heirs to something older than their own victories. That does not make the reigns literal. It makes them revealing. The long years show us a civilization trying to place authority inside cosmic time. The flood shows us a world divided between the unreachable before and the damaged after. The movement from city to city shows us an attempt to turn rivalry into sequence. The scribal form shows us how memory becomes durable when it is pressed into clay. And the silences remind us that official history often remembers the throne while leaving the people beneath it unnamed. This is why the King List still matters. Not because it proves that human beings once lived for tens of thousands of years. It does not. Not because it gives us a perfect historical chronology from the beginning of civilization. It does not do that either. Its value is stranger and, in some ways, deeper. It shows us how one of the earliest literate cultures imagined the origin of order. For the Sumerians, at least in this tradition, history was not a bare sequence of events. It was a sacred pattern. Time could be symbolic. Numbers could carry theological weight. Cities could become vessels of divine authority. A king could be both a political figure and a sign that heaven had not abandoned the earth. The impossible survived because it answered questions that ordinary facts could not answer fully. Why should anyone rule? Why should one city matter more than another? How can power continue after catastrophe? How can the present claim the authority of the beginning? The King List answered with names, cities, and years so large that they pushed memory beyond the human horizon. Its first kings stand there still, not as biographies we can recover, but as shadows cast by an ancient need to make power meaningful. And perhaps that is the final lesson. Civilization did not begin only with walls, fields, canals, and writing. It also began with explanation. Human beings built cities, and then they had to explain why those cities should obey. They created rulers, and then they had to imagine where rulership came from. They suffered floods, collapse, rivalry, and loss. And then they had to place those wounds into a story that could continue. The Sumerian King List is one of those stories. A list, yes. A political artifact. A scribal construction. A mythic chronology. A distorted memory. A sacred argument. All of these at once. The clay does not give us the first kings as they were. It gives us the first kings as later memory needed them to be. Immense, remote, divinely framed, and older than the broken world that followed. That may be why, after thousands of years, the list still feels unsettling. It does not merely ask us to wonder whether ancient people believed impossible things. It asks us to look at our own histories, our own monuments, our own official stories, and notice how often power still searches for heaven above it and antiquity behind it. The first kings remain in shadow, but the shadow tells us something. At the beginning of history, humanity was already asking not only who ruled, but why rule itself should exist. And the answer was written in years too vast to be true, yet too meaningful to disappear.